The morning after my wedding, before I had even unpacked a single suitcase, my mother-in-law knocked on our bedroom door holding a laminated sheet of paper. It had columns. It had a heading printed in bold. And at the bottom, underlined twice, was a single sentence that would end up costing her everything she thought she controlled. The wife eats last, and only if there's food remaining. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I certainly did. I read it once. Then I read it again, slower, the way you read a contract when something feels off but you can't yet say what. And then, instead of crying, instead of arguing, I smiled, thanked her, and asked if I could borrow a pen. She had no idea what that pen was going to cost her. My name is Rowena Atwood. I'm 34, and I work as a financial controller for a regional hospital network in Columbus, Ohio. My entire career is built on one simple skill: noticing the small inconsistency before it becomes the six-figure problem. I read budget lines the way other people read faces. I can look at a spreadsheet and feel, almost before I can prove it, that something underneath it isn't what it claims to be. I tell you this now, at the very beginning, because you need to understand exactly what kind of woman my mother-in-law was dealing with when she handed me that chart. She thought she was establishing dominance over a new bride. What she actually did was hand a forensic auditor the first loose thread of a much bigger story, and once I find a loose thread, I have never once in my life been able to leave it alone. My husband is Rutledge Cole. We met at a fundraising gala 18 months before our wedding, and from our very first conversation he struck me as steady, warm, and just a little shy about how much he'd built with his own two hands. He ran the small logistics company his father had started before passing away, and he spoke about his mother, Vestal Griggs, with a tenderness that made my chest ache a little. He'd say things like, "She raised me alone and never once complained," and I remember thinking, watching his face soften every time he said her name, that I was about to marry into a family with a mother worth admiring. I want you to really feel that moment with me, because it's important. I walked into this marriage with an open heart and genuine respect for a woman I hadn't even met yet. The wedding itself was lovely. Cream-colored linens, a string quartet playing something soft under the tent, a toast from Rutledge's best friend that made half the room cry. Vestal wore navy silk and smiled for every single photograph, and I remember watching her laugh with the caterers and thinking, quietly, that I had gotten lucky. That I'd found not just a good man, but a family that would hold me the way families are supposed to. I did not yet understand that Vestal did not see our marriage as a woman gaining a family. She saw it as a hostile takeover of a company she had run alone, unquestioned, for 30 years. And women like that do not hand over the keys. They defend the perimeter. So there I stood, one morning into married life, holding a laminated chart with kitchen hours, thermostat rules, a note that the good china was for Vestal's use only, ever, and at the very bottom, in bold, underlined twice, the line about who was allowed to eat, and when, and how much would be left for me. Rutledge opened his mouth to object. Vestal raised one hand, the way you'd silence a dog mid-bark, and he closed his mouth again without another word. That single gesture told me everything I needed to know about how every conversation in that house had gone for the last 30 years. And it told me something else, too, something that would matter far more later. It told me that the real rulebook in that house had never been written down at all. This laminated chart was only the part she was willing to show me. I smiled, not the smile of a woman who'd just been put in her place, but the smile of someone who audits things for a living and had just been handed a written document with her own name placed at the bottom of a hierarchy she never agreed to. This is very organized, I told her. I like structure. I'll follow it exactly as written. Vestal blinked. I think she'd been expecting tears, or maybe a fight, something she knew how to win. Instead, I folded the chart neatly, set it back on the dresser, and went to bed as if nothing at all had happened. But nothing about that night was nothing. Because that night, lying in the dark while Rutledge whispered an apology for his mother's particular ways, I made a decision I didn't tell him about yet. If Vestal wanted structure, I was going to give her more structure than she had ever asked for. The next morning, I woke at 5:45, showered, and dressed for work in a charcoal blazer, the kind of outfit that says I take numbers seriously and I do not get flustered. I came downstairs at exactly 6. Vestal was already seated at the head of the table with her coffee, waiting to be served like a queen at her own coronation, while Rutledge stood at the stove badly attempting scrambled eggs, because apparently the household chart had never actually specified who was supposed to cook, only who was allowed to eat first. I poured myself a single cup of black coffee, took an apple from the counter, and picked up my car keys. "Rowena, sit down," Vestal said. "Someone needs to make breakfast. And this is the moment I want you to remember, because it's the moment everything quietly turned. I'd love to help," I told her, "but according to the household order, I'm not permitted to prepare food, since I'm only allowed what remains after the ranked members have eaten. If I cook it, I'd be handling the meal before you've had yours, which the chart specifically says is disrespectful. I wouldn't want to break a rule on only my second day." Rutledge dropped the spatula. Vestal's face went the color of the tablecloth. And I left for work at 6:15, taking my apple with me. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for exactly 90 seconds and let myself laugh. The kind of laugh that only comes out when you realize the person trying to control you has just handed you the instruction manual for undoing her. Because Vestal did not know one important thing about me yet. I don't just read financial statements. I trace where money actually goes, versus where people say it goes. And a woman who prints a laminated household hierarchy is a woman who has spent 30 years building a very particular kind of order, one I hadn't even begun to look into. Not yet. But I would. And what I found underneath that laminated sheet of paper was not a quirky mother-in-law's eccentricity. It was the outline of something much darker, hiding in plain sight for 7 long years. Over the following weeks, the chart became the least of my problems, because it turned out to be a symptom, not the disease. Vestal ran the household finances, not just her household, ours. She insisted on paying the mortgage on the house we all shared, a house she owned outright, and she reminded us constantly that this generosity came with obligations. Dinner had to be at 6. Guests required 48 hours notice. My work calls, taken from the home office, were apparently disruptive to the household rhythm. I stayed calm through all of it, because I am trained to stay calm around people who mistake volume for an argument. But what actually worried me wasn't the rules. Rules, I can work around. What worried me was watching Rutledge shrink every single time his mother raised her voice. Not physically, he's over 6 feet tall, but something in his posture changed, like a much smaller version of him was still living inside that frame, still 9 years old, still waiting to be corrected. And that was the moment I understood. Vestal hadn't just raised a son. She had built a manager. One who learned, decades ago, that disagreeing with her cost more than it was worth. So I started paying attention the way I would with any account that didn't reconcile. And the first inconsistency was small, almost nothing. Vestal mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd recently helped Rutledge catch up on a business loan, something to do with a warehouse lease. Rutledge had never once mentioned a loan to me. When I asked him about it that night, he looked uncomfortable and said his mother handled some of the company's older paperwork, a holdover from when he first started the business, and that she'd co-signed things to help him get off the ground. I asked to see the paperwork. He said he'd ask her for it. He never did, because every time he brought it up, she changed the subject, usually by finding something about my behavior that needed correcting instead. And if you've ever done audit work like I have, you already know this pattern by heart. When someone won't produce a document, the document is always the problem. There was a night about a month into our marriage when the pattern showed itself more clearly than Vestal probably intended. Rutledge came home late, exhausted, and mentioned over dinner that he was thinking about expanding the company into a second warehouse across town, a real opportunity he'd clearly been quietly excited about for weeks. Vestal set down her fork. "You'll need to run that by me before you sign anything," she said. And Rutledge nodded automatically, the way you'd nod at a stop sign, not a decision, a reflex. I asked, as gently as I could, why a business expansion needed his mother's approval when the company was legally his. And Vestal answered before he could even open his mouth. "Because I have a stake in that business staying stable, Rowena. More than you understand right now." I remember that sentence exactly, word for word, because it was the first time she'd said something true by accident. A stake. Not an interest. Not concern. A stake, the kind of word people use when they mean something with numbers attached to it, not sentiment. I filed that sentence away the same way I file away a suspicious line item on any ledger. Not accusing anyone yet. Just refusing to let myself forget it existed. So I started looking. It took 3 weeks, mostly evenings, after Vestal had gone to bed, going through boxes of old paperwork Rutledge kept in the garage. Invoices, lease agreements, tax filings from the early years of his company that he'd never fully organized because, in his own words, Mom always handled the money stuff. The boxes weren't organized, but they weren't random either. Whoever assembled them had clearly wanted the important documents buried under years of unrelated receipts. The kind of filing that looks like carelessness but functions like camouflage. I've seen that trick before, usually in departments where someone very badly does not want an audit to go smoothly. I almost admired it. Almost. It took several more nights of cross-referencing dates before the shape of it finally became clear. A folder labeled simply 2019 Warehouse contained the original loan agreement. 6 dense pages that Rutledge had signed without reading closely, trusting completely that his mother had his best interests at heart. Attached to it was a second document, a security agreement, filed separately, and never once mentioned to him directly. And this is where the story stops being about breakfast and starts being about something far more serious. 7 years earlier, when Rutledge was struggling to keep his father's company alive after a bad contract fell through, Vestal had stepped in, exactly as she always told the story. But she hadn't structured it as a loan to Rutledge. She'd structured it as a loan to herself, secured against the business itself, with an unusually high interest rate and repayment terms that gave her, not Rutledge, the legal right to seize company assets if a single payment came in even a week late. I read the seizure clause 4 times before I let myself accept what it actually meant. It wasn't leverage in the abstract. It meant that if Rutledge's monthly payment ever arrived late, something that had already happened at least twice during slow seasons, Vestal held the contractual right to walk into his company and claim its equipment, its vehicles, its client contracts, as her own. For 7 years, Rutledge had been running a business that legally belonged to him and functionally belonged to whoever was holding that lien. For 7 years, he had been quietly repaying what he believed was informal family kindness. In reality, he had been paying down a hostile lien his own mother held over the company he'd built with his own 2 hands, a lien that gave her the power to take it from him at almost any moment she chose. And suddenly, that laminated household chart made perfect, chilling sense. It was never really about breakfast. It was one small, visible piece of a much larger architecture. A woman who had built formal financial control over her son's entire life and dressed it up as tradition and love. I sat with what I'd found for a long time before I told him, not because I was afraid of his reaction, but because I needed to be absolutely certain I wasn't misreading a document out of anger before I put it in front of a man whose entire understanding of his mother was about to change forever. When I finally laid the documents out on our kitchen table, highlighting the clauses that mattered, Rutledge went very quiet. Then he asked me to read him the interest rate again. Then he asked me to read the seizure clause a 3rd time, as if the words might somehow change if he heard them enough times. They didn't. He put his head in his hands and told me, very softly, that he'd always wondered why he never quite felt like the business was really his. I didn't gloat, because I hadn't told him so. I'd simply followed the numbers where they led, the same way I follow them for any client. But I told him one thing, clearly and without flinching. You have options here. And you don't have to keep pretending this is generosity. We didn't confront Vestal right away. I'm not someone who explodes the moment she uncovers a problem. I build a case, I confirm it twice, and I choose the exact setting where it will land hardest. So we waited 3 more weeks, during which I continued to follow every single rule on that ridiculous laminated chart with exaggerated politeness, letting Vestal believe she'd successfully trained me into submission. Meanwhile, Rutledge quietly met with a business attorney I'd worked with years earlier, a sharp, understated woman named Journey Hart, who specialized in exactly this kind of family lending arrangement. Journey confirmed what I'd already suspected. The loan documents were legally binding, but riddled with disclosure failures. Vestal had never required Rutledge to have an independent legal review, a requirement for a loan of that size secured against a business asset. That single missing signature was our leverage. Real leverage. Not the kind printed on laminated paper. Journey also told us something I hadn't considered. Don't open with a threat, she said. People like this don't respond to threats. They respond to being outmaneuvered quietly, on their own terms, in front of witnesses who matter to them. Rutledge understood immediately, because his mother cared, more than almost anything, about appearing reasonable. So we chose the one setting where reasonableness would be the only acceptable performance in the room, a Sunday dinner. Vestal loved Sunday dinners, because they were, in her own words, when the family remembers its structure. I cooked that night for the first time since the wedding, a gesture that visibly pleased her. She even told me, halfway through the meal, that I was finally learning my place. I waited until dessert. Vestal, I said, setting down my fork, I wanted to thank you for everything you did to help Rutledge's business stay afloat 7 years ago. That kind of support means a great deal. She beamed, exactly as I expected. Family helps family, she said. Someone has to hold things together. It really does mean a lot, I continued, which is why I think it's time we finally formalize it properly. Journey Hart, our attorney, mentioned that loans secured against a business need an independent legal review to be enforceable. Since that never happened, the lien you're holding technically isn't valid. So we'd like to restructure it as what it actually was, a gift, or a standard low-interest family loan with fair terms, whichever you prefer. The room went completely silent. And then Rutledge, to his enormous credit, didn't look at his shoes this time. He looked directly at his mother. Mom, I've been paying you for 7 years thinking I was helping keep the business in the family. I didn't know you could take it from me the moment I missed a single payment. I need that fixed today, or our lawyer says a judge decides instead of us. Vestal's face cycled through outrage, then disbelief, then something close to panic, before finally landing on the one expression she'd always relied on, righteous offense. After everything I've done for this family, this is how you repay me, with lawyers. You're the one who brought legal paperwork into this family first, I said gently. We're just making sure it's fair for everyone. The same way your household chart was supposed to be fair. Structure keeps peace, remember. She tried one last angle, the one that had worked on Rutledge for 30 years, softening her voice, telling him she was disappointed he'd let an outsider turn him against his own mother. But Rutledge didn't flinch this time. She's not an outsider, Mom. She's my wife. And you're the one who taught me that family means honesty. I'm just finally asking you to practice it too. Vestal had no answer for that. There isn't a good answer for being handed back your own words with the sharp edges still attached. It took another 6 weeks of negotiation, mediated mostly by Journey, before Vestal finally agreed to release the lien entirely, in exchange for a modest, interest-free repayment plan Rutledge could complete in 2 years instead of carrying indefinitely. She never apologized outright. Some people simply can't. But something in that household shifted after that dinner. The laminated chart quietly disappeared from the kitchen counter, and nobody ever mentioned who removed it. There was one moment near the end of those 6 weeks that stayed with me longer than any of the paperwork. Vestal called me on a weekday afternoon, something she had never once done before, and asked, almost carefully, whether the business was going to be all right. Not whether she'd been forgiven. Not whether the family would recover. Just whether the company, the thing she'd built her leverage around for 7 years, would survive without her holding the leash. I told her it would. I think that was the only honest conversation the two of us ever had. 6 months later, Rutledge and I bought our own place, a modest brick house 20 minutes away, close enough for holidays, far enough that no one could ever hand either of us a laminated chart at 6 in the morning again. Rutledge started seeing a therapist, something I gently suggested, and a year in, he told me it had changed how he understood his entire childhood, not just the loan. He said once, almost as an afterthought, that he finally understood the difference between being taken care of and being kept. Vestal still visits. She still occasionally hints that today's young women don't understand respect. But she asks before she opens our kitchen cabinets now, and she has never again suggested that anyone in our house eats last. I think about that laminated chart sometimes, the one she was so proud of, the one meant to put me in my place before I'd even unpacked my suitcase. She thought she was teaching me the rules of her house. What she actually did was hand a financial controller a printed document proving exactly how her family's power had always worked, and exactly where its foundation had been quietly cracking for 7 years, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. She wanted a daughter-in-law who would eat last and ask no questions. She got one who read every line first. So tell me, if someone handed you a rule book like that on your very first morning as a bride, would you have followed it quietly, or would you have started reading between the lines, the way I did?